There's a fair few signals coming in on the 80 metre band this morning. So there are radio waves hitting the antenna above the house and they're coming down the coaxial feeder into this receiver. Perhaps there's 100, perhaps there's 200 signals, maybe even more than that, I don't know. We're listening to just one signal at the moment. Let's see how many others we can find.
You think would do you? I believe it's better for me to stay in the wall, I think, David, over.
So with so many signals coming into this receiver, how is it that we don't hear all of those signals at once? Of course, if we did, we wouldn't be able to understand any single one of them. So how is it that the radio can sort out, can filter out one particular frequency, one particular radio signal at a time? How does it do that? Well, let's go into the other room and I'll show you. You'll remember that in the previous video we saw that inductors and capacitors work in exactly opposite ways when you pass an alternating current through them. Their reactiveness is opposite. So a capacitor, for instance, if you increase the frequency of an alternating current as it goes through a capacitor, it allows more of the signal to go through it. With an inductor, if you increase the frequency of an alternating current, it allows less of the current to go through it, less of the signal to get through the inductor. And on the graph we saw that where these two reactions cross, a special event occurred. I mentioned to you, it's called a resonant frequency. And it's very interesting because resonant frequencies of series tuned inductors and capacitors offer us a very interesting path to being able to select one particular frequency. So what we're going to do is to check out what this inductor and this capacitor do if we try and pass a signal, a radio signal, an alternating current through them. And we'll see what happens when we get to that point where on the graph the two lines crossed. So when you have a capacitor and an inductor and you connect them together, you create what's known as a tuned circuit. And there are two ways that you can operate a tuned circuit, or you can connect a tuned circuit, I could say. You could connect them in series, such as we see here. So all the signal has to go first through the capacitor and then through the inductor, or left to right, first through the inductor and then through the capacitor. That's a series tuned circuit. Or we could connect them in parallel to become a parallel tuned circuit, like that. In which case we would feed the signal in on one side and it would come out of the other side, but having gone through both the inductor and the capacitor at pretty much the same time. So we're just going to have a look here and see what happens to this tuned circuit, which is connected, or it will be connected in series if I can straighten the little wires out. Well, a little bit kinky, but never mind. Whoops, come here. Ah, you little so-and-so. So, a series tuned circuit, and we're going to see what happens when we send different frequencies through this tuned circuit, we're going to see on the meter how much signal passes through at different frequencies. So let's see what happens then when we send a 1 megahertz signal through a series tuned circuit. And we turn it on and we get a reading of just under 2 volts. Turn it off, go up to 2 megahertz. Turn it on. Whoa, we go 6.5 volts there. And if we increase the frequency again, we'll go to 4 megahertz and turn it on. Oh no, it's come back down. It's just a tad over 3 volts there. Right, so let's see how we go here, and we'll plot some of those voltages. We saw that at 1 megahertz, 2 volts came through, or the series tuned circuit allowed 2 volts of energy through. At 2 megahertz, it allowed 6.5 volts through, which I reckon stands at about there. And at 4 megahertz, I have a confession, we didn't do 3 megahertz, did we? So we'll have to scratch. I did it on a previous take, but on this particular take that you saw just a moment ago, I didn't do a 3 volts test. But anyway, at 4 megs, it allowed 3 volts through. So let's come up to 3 volts, which is there. And if we join the dots, dot to dot, we can see that at one particular frequency, namely 2 megahertz, a great deal more voltage came through that series tuned circuit. In fact, even from its lowest point, a good 3.5 volts more came through. So frequencies of more than 4 megahertz, here's 5 megahertz and here's 6 megahertz, etc., they don't make it. They're not allowed through. And frequencies of less than 1 megahertz won't make it either. It's a bit like if you imagine using a sieve, a garden sieve, and you pour a load of stuff on top of the sieve and shake the sieve, only the fine material comes out the bottom, only the finest stuff comes out the bottom. The bricks and the stones and the bits and pieces get left on top, and then they're discarded. But the fine stuff gets through. Well, here we see that frequencies are sorted in a similar manner. Frequencies below 1 megahertz don't get in, frequencies above 4 megahertz don't get in, but frequencies at 2 megahertz are allowed through. And this is one of the reasons why series tuned circuits are often known as acceptor circuits. So there is our series tuned circuit. The signal has to go through the inductor and then it goes through the capacitor one at a time. This is an acceptor circuit. It accepts I'm getting tongue-tied here, accepts signals at certain frequencies. And this 3.5 volt difference here, or thereabouts 3.5 volts, could well be enough to trigger, say, a diode. It could turn a diode on, which would then allow the signal at 2 megahertz to go on and be amplified and come out of the loudspeaker of your radio receiver. So here we have it then, a series tuned circuit being acting, I should say, as a filter to filter out just the signals that we want. So that then was a series tuned circuit. Now let's have a look and see what a parallel tuned circuit performs like. Parallel tuned circuit's slightly different because the capacitor and the coil are connected in parallel, as the name implies. And lo and behold, I've got one made earlier, so we can actually use that to see how a real parallel tuned circuit would work. bit crowded on the bench. This is a transceiver. This is going to be acting as our signal generator, and this is our famous analog multimeter. This here is the parallel tuned circuit. It actually forms part of an aerial system, or it was intending to. I never quite got around to it. And this is the so-called dummy load, which will stop the signals that come through the parallel tuned circuit from the signal generator, the transmitter. This will stop the signals being radiated out into space and causing an annoyance to people. It's simply going to convert the radio waves into heat, in essence. Or I keep saying radio waves, I mean radio signal, into heat. And that's why, if you might be able to see here, it's, oh, one of the clips has come off. It's got fins, cooling fins on it, to stop it from overheating. Just going to have to reconnect the clip that came off there, and then we'll sit down and actually start doing some readings of what happens at different frequencies. Here's the meter, here's the transmitter. It is actually a transceiver here. And in a moment, when I turn the transceiver to transmit, then we'll see we get a deflection on the needle at a frequency of 10.718 megahertz, as in this case. So let's turn the meter on, let's turn the transmitter on, and we get an almost full-scale deflection at 10.7 megahertz. Now let's see what happens as I gradually increase the frequency. The meter needle wavers a little bit, but generally speaking it's coming down. We're getting less power coming out of that parallel tuned circuit as the frequency goes up. Now at 12.3 megahertz and rising in frequency, and we can see that the meter needle is coming back. It's settled now, or pretty much around the same level, but as the frequency increases, now more signal is beginning to come out of the parallel tuned circuit on average. So let's do that again. Here we are at 14.4 megahertz, and we can see the needle is over here. Now let's reduce the frequency. As we come back down in frequency, 13.6, it's got slightly less, coming down to 12.6 megahertz, and it's come off quite substantially, the meter. But now, even though the frequency is continuing to go down, the amount of signal coming out of the parallel tuned circuit is going up again. So we can see that at a frequency of around about 12, 12.3, 12.5, 12.6, no, around about 13 megahertz, we get the least amount of signal coming out of the parallel tuned circuit. And at frequencies above 13 megahertz or below 13 megahertz, we get progressively more signal coming out of the parallel tuned circuit.